paraded naked through the town square at noon. A Lakota chief covered her and took her home. The rope came first. Not the sound of the crowd, not the heat off the packed dirt of Caldwell's main street. Just the rope. A yellowed hemp thing looped under her arms and dragged taut across the back of a mule. I was watching from the edge of the Garrity's feed store awning, still mounted. Paint mare, restless, under me, the way she gets when something in the air is wrong. Chayton was maybe 40 yards behind me on his own horse, too far to read my face. Good. My face was doing things I didn't want him to see. I had ridden into Caldwell for flour and dry salt and a replacement bolt for the south gate hinge. That was all. There was not supposed to be anything else. But there she was. They had her arms tied behind her back at the wrists. Tied with leather, not rope. Told you someone had planned this. The rope around her chest was for the crowd. For the theater of it. Her dress had been torn from the shoulder. Most of the front, and what was left, hung at her hips and caught on itself when she stumbled. Her hair was loose and matted, and one side of her face was swollen, the bruised purple of a late plum. She was not crying. That was the first thing I noticed. Every woman I have seen in that kind of shame has either been screaming or folded into herself, trying to disappear. She was neither. She kept her chin up and her eyes on a place straight ahead, something in the middle distance that did not exist, one foot down, and then the other, and she walked. The man holding the mule's lead rope was Clem Havers, deputy, the man who had arranged her this way. I knew Clem. I knew his father, and his father's way of settling accounts was always to humiliate first and ask afterward. Clem had learned everything there was to learn. Behind the mule came maybe 30 people. Some of the men had their hats off and were shouting. Some of the women had their mouths pressed tight and were watching from behind their husbands' shoulders the way women do, when they know that to look too long means they themselves might be measured. A few children at the back edge of the crowd had no understanding yet of what they were witnessing. They would. They learn. I sat on my mare and I watched, and I felt something rise in me that I recognized. It is not anger exactly, though anger is in it. It is older than anger. It is the thing that has no word in English, but, in Lakota, we call something close to the burning that comes when a wrong thing is permitted to continue, because no one with the power to stop it has yet decided they will bear the cost. I have carried that burning many times. On the reservation, at the agency, treaty tables where men signed paper with one hand and took land with the other. I know what it weighs. I rode forward. Not fast. A chief does not rush toward a thing like this. Rushing says you have not decided yet. It says a fear is driving you forward. I walked my mare out into the street at an angle that put me between Clem Havers and the crowd, and I stopped. Clem looked up. He knew me. I had traded at Caldwell for 6 years, and there was not a merchant or lawman in that town who did not know who I was and what I represented. It was the largest ranching concern north of the Cimarron, and a man who had thus far caused no trouble, and was, therefore, to be tolerated if not respected. Makwa, Clem said. He always used my trading name, the one the previous agent had given me, because my real name he could not or would not attempt. I did not look at him. I was looking at the woman. She had stopped when my horse stepped in front of her. For the first time, she broke her gaze from that middle distance she had been keeping, and she looked up at me. Her eyes were brown, almost black, and they were dry. Whatever she had already spent, she was not going to spend any more of it here on this street in front of these people. I have seen courage in many men. I have seen it take different shapes. This was one of the shapes it takes. I reached back and untied the bedroll from behind my saddle. It was my own blanket, a heavy wool trade blanket, red and brown, and I dropped off the mare in one motion and walked to her, and I put it around, shoulders. The crowd went quiet. Not the held breath kind of quiet that precedes something, the genuinely silenced kind. People are working out what they are seeing before they can decide how to react. Clem said, "Now, Ma." I turned and looked at him, and I did not say anything. I have found over the years that there is a particular kind of silence that is more useful than most arguments. Clem Havers had seen me use it at treaty negotiations and at the Garrities, when a freighter tried to short my load, and at the agency office when they tried to cut our winter allotment by a third. He recognized it. He closed his mouth. I looked at the leather binding her wrists. I had a belt knife on my right hip. I took it and I cut the leather in one stroke, and the pieces fell to the dirt. Then I said to the woman, quietly, only for her, "Can you ride?" She swallowed once. She said, "Yes." I put her on the mare. I took the lead rope and I walked that horse through the crowd, parted. They always part, because the alternative is to stand in my way, and there was not a man in Caldwell that day prepared to be the one. Stood in my way, and I walked to the hitching post where Chayton was waiting. His face was unreadable, and his eyes were moving across the crowd, counting and sorting, the way I had taught him to count and sort. When you go somewhere, you might have to leave quickly. I tied the mare's lead to Chayton's saddle. I looked at him. I said in Lakota, "Keep close and keep the rifle across your lap." He said, in Lakota, "And if they follow." I said they won't. They didn't. Her name was Nora Blaine, and she was the daughter of a mixed-blood trader named Caswell. Blaine, who had died 4 years prior, leaving her the trading rights to his small post on the Cimarron crossing, and no money and no husband and no particular protection. She had been running the post herself. She had apparently done this well enough to irritate certain men in Caldwell, who had been wanting that crossing for years because a man named Darnell Pruitt had come to her with papers. He said were a legal claim to the land. And when she had refused to sign them, he had gone to his friend Clem Havers, who was the kind of law that is available for purchase, and the rest of it I had seen in the street. She told me this in pieces, over the first 2 days at my ranch. Not all at once. She would say a thing and then stop and look at her hands, or look at the window, or just stop, and I did not push her toward the next piece. I let her tell it the way she needed to tell it, which was the same way I have needed to tell hard things. Sideways, in fragments, never all at once. My ranch, the Wicasa spread, the Garrity brothers' original name for it that I had kept, because it was what everyone knew, sat about 14 miles, north and west of Caldwell, backed up to a long draw of cottonwoods that marked a branch creek feeding the Cimarron. I had been here 11 years. I had 12 hands, 3 of them Lakota, 2 of them Cheyenne, and 7 of them a mix of white and Mexican, and 1 man from Tennessee who never talked about where he came from and was the best judge of horseflesh I had ever met. We ran cattle, mostly, some horses for trade. I had a house that was stone on the ground level and timber above, not big but solid, and a cookhouse separate, and enough bunkhouses for the hands, and a barn that was the best built thing on the property. My wife had been dead for 9 years, Ampetu Tokahe. She had died in the winter of '73 from a fever that I could not stop, and that the agency doctor could not come in time to stop, and that I have accepted. Mostly, I have accepted most things. It is how you survive long enough to be useful. I gave Nora Blaine the room off the back of the house that had been a storage room, and that I had cleaned out the first winter, when I thought I might have a guest and then never did. My housekeeper, an older Cheyenne woman named Mazzy, that the hands all called grandmother, made no particular comment about any of this, which was its own kind of comment. Mazzy communicated mainly in the quality of her silences. The swelling on Nora's face went down over 3 days. On the 4th day, she came out to the table for the morning meal properly instead of eating in room, and she sat down across from me, and she said without preamble, "I don't know how to thank you." I was pouring coffee. I said, "You don't need to. That's not how I was raised. How were you raised?" She looked at me directly. She was not a soft-looking woman. She had her father's jaw, a little too square for the prettiness she might otherwise have had. And her hands had the rough knuckles of someone who had done real work, and there was something in the way she set her eyes on a thing. Direct, like she was The weight of it that reminded me of how I have seen certain older women on the reservation look at the land when they are trying to decide what it is telling them. She said, "Raised to pay what I owe." I said, "You don't owe me anything. Why did you do it then?" I thought about that honestly. I could have given her the clean version of the answer, the version that sounds like virtue, but I was tired that morning, and Mazzy had not yet brought the biscuits. And I have a low tolerance for my own performance. So, I told her the true version. I said, "Because I have seen that kind of wrong permitted too many times. And I was tired of being a man who watched." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the best reason I've ever heard for anything." She did not go back to the trading post. Not right away. Was the matter of Arnell Pruitt's papers, which needed to be contested, and contesting them required a lawyer, and the only lawyer worth talking to in that part of the territory was in Wichita. I offered to send word. She accepted. She was not a woman who accepted things lightly or without thinking about the cost of accepting. I could see her working the accounting in her head every time I offered anything. And what I came to understand gradually was that she was not suspicious of me. She was suspicious of debt, of being beholden. She had been beholden to her father, and then to her father's absence, and she had worked very hard to owe nothing to no one. And she was not in the habit of starting over on that. I respected it, more than respected it. It was actually the quality in her I most recognized, knees. Because I had spent a long time myself in the particular pride of needing nothing from anyone, which is the pride that keeps you alive in certain situations and hollows you out in others. While we waited for the Wichita lawyer's answer, she earned her keep. That was her phrase. I did not require it. She required it of herself. She fixed fence line alongside the hands and did it better than two of them. She helped Mazzy with the rendering. She had a way with the horses that Eli, the Tennessee man, noticed and commented on, which was his highest form of praise. To notice out loud. The hands were curious about her, but they were my hands, which meant they were careful with their curiosity. No one asked anything they didn't need to know. That is the culture I have built. A man's business is a man's business, and if he wants to share it, he will. She asked me questions. In the evenings, mostly, after the meal, when we sat on the porch, if the night was good, or at the table if it was not. She asked about the Wikesa spread, and how I had come to it. She asked about Ong Petutaka without knowing who she was asking about. She asked about a woman's photograph on the shelf in the main room, and I told her. She listened to the whole of it, without flinching or saying she was sorry the way people do when they want the subject changed. She said at the end, she had a beautiful face. It was exactly the right thing to say, and she knew it. She asked about the reservation and the treaty and the agency. I told her what she asked without editorializing. She editorialized herself. She said, at one point, "It's legal robbery." I said, "Yes," she said, and everyone just, and then she stopped, because she knew the answer. She had watched her own father navigate that world. I asked her questions too, about the trading post, about her father, about what she had done alone out there for 4 years. She told me. She was not modest about it. She had done it by being better at the work than anyone expected a woman alone to be, by being useful to enough people that protecting her was more profitable than preying on her, and by being very careful and a little bit lucky. She said, until I wasn't. I said Pruitt was not luck or lack of it. He was a man who decided he could. She said, and Clem Havers was a man who agreed. I said, yes, there are always those two. She looked at me. You've run into your own Pruitts. It was not a question. I said many. And I said, and some of them I beat in court, and some I beat in business, and some I beat other ways, and some of them are still out there finding new ways to be that kind of man. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, you're still here, though. I said, I'm still here. The Wichita lawyer's name was Aldrich. He came out himself, which surprised me, though Chayton said he came because of who had sent for him, meaning me, and perhaps that was true. He reviewed the papers. He sat at my table with Nora, across from him, and he laid it out without varnishing it. The papers were fraudulent, had used a forged land office signature, and a description of the boundaries that did not match the original patent Caswell Blaine had held since 1868. Blaine's patent was real. Pruitt's papers were not. Nora said, "Can I take that to the federal land office?" Aldrich said she could. He said it might take 6 months, and it might take 2 years. And the outcome was not guaranteed, because the land office in Kansas had certain relationships with certain operators who, and here he glanced at me, who had the resources to cause delays. I said, "How long would it take if I accompanied Miss Blaine to Wichita?" Aldrich thought about that. He said, "Considerably less time." Nora said, "I'm not asking you to do that." I said, "I know. I'm asking if you would allow it." She looked at me. Something moved across her face, a measurement being made that I did not have access to. And then she said, "Why would you?" I said, "Because Pruitt will try again. Maybe not the same way. But men like that, when they can't take a thing legally, they find another way. You need the land office record clean before he does," she said. "That's a practical reason," I said. "It is." She looked at me a moment longer. I held her gaze, then she said, "All right." We rode to Wichita in a party of 4. Nora and I and Chayton and the Tennessee man, whose name I will give here as Eli Craft, though that was not exactly his name. The ride took 2 days. We camped the first night in a low draw, sheltered from the wind by a limestone cutbank, and Eli built the fire, and Chayton took the first watch, and Nora and I sat beside the fire for a while after the meal. She said, "What did you tell them, your men?" "About what I am to you." I said, "I told them you were a guest." She said, "Is that all?" I said, "That's what I told them." She looked at the fire. After a time she said, "I'm not a woman who," and then she stopped and started differently. "I have spent 4 years being careful not to be dependent on any single person's goodwill, men especially." She said it plainly, no apology in it. I said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what I am in your house. I don't know how to name it." I said, "You don't have to name it." That's not an answer. I looked at her. The firelight was on her face and the bruise was mostly gone now, just a pale yellowish shadow below her left cheekbone, and her hair was plaited back, and she was wrapped in her own blanket now. I had gotten her a proper one at Caldwell, on our way out of town, having stopped at Garrity's long enough to buy what I had originally come for. She looked, in that light, exactly like what she was. A woman who had come through something hard and was still thinking, still measuring, still not finished. I said, "I think you know what you are to me." She said, "Tell me anyway." I said, "You're the first person I have brought into that house who was not a hand or a guest or someone passing through. You're the first person I've sat on that porch with and wanted to still be there when the sun went down. The fire popped. A coyote somewhere out in the dark said its piece and went quiet. She said, "I need to get my land back first." I said, "I know that, and I need to know I'm choosing. Not owing. Not repaying." I said, "The day you feel like you're repaying me is the day I've done something wrong." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." That was all. But the way she said it was different from the way she said it in Caldwell when I asked if she could ride. That time it was survival. This time it was something she was giving. And she knew I knew the difference. And knowing I knew the difference was, I think, a large part of it. The federal land office in Wichita sat on a street that smelled of river mud and horse, and the particular flatness of a town that had not yet decided what it was going to be. The clerk behind the counter was a young man named Beckwith, who had the look of someone who had recently been told what to expect when I walked in, and who was working very hard not to show that he had been told. Nora laid the papers on the counter. Aldrich laid his papers beside them. I stood to the left and I said nothing. I have found that in certain rooms in certain towns, the most effective thing I can do is simply be present and say nothing, and let the room decide what my presence means. The room generally decides correctly. Beckwith examined the documents. He called someone from the back. That person examined the documents. A third person was consulted by telegram. That consultation took the better part of an afternoon, during which Nora and I waited in the anteroom on a wooden bench that had been worn smooth by years of people sitting and waiting for rooms like this to decide things about their lives. At one point, she said quietly, "Are you bored?" I said. "No," she said. "You've been very still for a long time," I said. "I have waited in rooms like this before," she said. "I've waited in rooms like this before too." "I hate it," I said. "What do you do when you're waiting and you hate it?" she said. "Usually I'm planning what I'll do if it goes wrong," I said. "And now," she looked at her hands, she said, "now I'm thinking about what the south fence line needs if I'm going to run stock through the winter." I looked at her. I said, "You've already decided to go back." She said, "Did you think I hadn't?" I said, "I wasn't sure you'd want to." She said, "It's my land. Father built that post. I'm not leaving it for Darnell Pruitt." She paused. "I'm going back," I said. "I know." She looked at me sidelong. "And?" I said. "And that post is 14 miles from my south line." She said, "I know where your land ends." I said, "I know you know." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Beckwith called us back to the counter at 4:30. The telegram had been answered. The original Blaine patent was confirmed. The Pruitt papers were flagged for investigation. Nora Blaine's claim to the Cimarron Crossing post stood. She thanked Beckwith in a voice that held not one unnecessary thing. She took the certified copy of the confirmation, and she folded it twice, and she it inside her coat, next to her body. Then she turned to me. She said, "Thank you." I said, "This was yours before you came to Wichita." She said, "I mean for everything," I said. "I know what you mean." We stood on the steps of the land office in the afternoon light. Chayton and Eli behind us with the horses. And she looked out at the street for a moment, and I watched her breathe. And then she turned to me, and I don't know entirely what she saw when she looked at me. I am not a man who spends much time imagining what other people see. But I know what I felt when she looked at me that way. It was the feeling of being seen entirely, the whole of it, the ranch and the years, and Angpetu Tokahe and the treaty tables, and the long, careful life I had built out of what had been left, seen and not found wanting. She looked at me and she reached up, and she put her hand along the side of my jaw, her palm flat against the bone, and she held it there. I covered her hand with mine. She said, in a voice I don't think she intended to be so quiet. "You're a good man," I said. "I try." She said, "No, you are." A pause. "I don't say that about many." I believed her. We rode back on a different route, south and west, because I wanted to show her the stretch of bottom land along the creek where the soil was heavy and dark, and the cottonwoods grew so thick you lost the sky. I don't know why I wanted to show her. I had not shown anyone that stretch since Angpetu Tokaha, who had loved it because, in the fall, the leaves went gold all at once, and the whole bottom blazed for about 5 days before the first real wind took them. Nora sat her horse in the middle of it and looked up through the canopy at the light coming through the leaves. Were not yet turning. It was still summer, barely past. But the green of them was deep and particular, and the creek ran cold even in August. She said, "Is this yours?" I said, "Comes with the south line." She said, "It's beautiful." I said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "You brought me here on purpose." I said, "I did." She looked back up at the canopy. Something in her settled. I could see it happen. The way you can see weather change over flat land. The way the light shifts and the pressure in the air goes different. She said, "All right." She had a way of saying all right that said more than all right. She went back to the Cimarron post. That was in September. She took with her 2 of my hands. Chayton's choice, not mine. He having decided, without being asked, that she should not ride back alone, and that these 2 particular men were the right ones for the ride. And a mule with supplies I sent that she accepted without argument told me she had stopped keeping that ledger between us. The post was in worse shape than she had left it. Its men had helped themselves to what they could carry. But the walls stood, and the roof held. and the stove was intact, and the crossing rights still hers. By October, she had it running again. I heard this from the Garrity brothers, who heard it from a freighter who had stopped at the Cimarron post and been surprised to find a woman behind the counter who knew prices better than most men and kept a shotgun on, hook at shoulder height and within arm's reach at all times. I rode down in October to see it myself. I told myself it was the south fence line. She was behind the counter when I came in. She looked up and she said, "I wondered when you'd come." Not a greeting, a statement of fact. I looked around the post. She had put it back in order. Better order than I had expected. There was a new shelf on the east wall, and she had rebuilt the counter slightly higher, which I noticed because it put the shotgun in a better position. I said, "The fence needs work along the creek draw." She said, "I know. I saw it 2 weeks ago," I said. "I brought 2 men to start on it." She said, "I've got someone coming Tuesday," I said. "Then I've got 2 extra men." She looked at me. She almost smiled again. The almost smile I had learned to read as the closest she generally got. She said, "You're going to be difficult about this." I said, "About what?" She said, "About the fence and the supplies and Chayton's men and—" I said, "I haven't done anything." She said, "You're planning to." I said, "Plan to check my south fence line regularly." She said, "It's 14 miles from your main house." I said, "It's an important fence." She was quiet. Then she came around the counter, which surprised me. She was not a woman who moved toward things without deciding to. And she stood in front of me, and she looked up at me for a moment, and then she put her arms around me, both arms, and she held on. I held her back. She said into my coat, "I'm not someone who needs saving." I said, "I know that." She said, "I just needed someone to get me off that street." I said, "I know." She said, "And I need someone too." She stopped. She said differently, "I need you." I said, "I know that too." Pulled back enough to look at me. Her eyes were dry. They were always dry. She said, 14 miles is far." I said, "It depends on what you're riding toward." She looked at me for a long moment. The light through the trading post window was the autumn kind. Low and flat and very clear. The kind that doesn't soften anything but makes everything look exactly as it is. She looked at me in that light, and I let her look. She said, "Ask me what you want to ask me." I said, "Come home." She breathed once. She said, "Post." I said, "I know a man who can manage a post." She said, "It would need to still be mine." I said, "It stays yours. The crossing stays yours. Your name on the patent stays your name." She said, "And what would I be in your house?" I said, "Mine." She held very still. Then she said, quietly, "All right." That was the third time she said it that way. The third and the last time she ever needed to. She came back to the wheat casa spread in November, when the first snow was putting itself down light and steady over the creek bottom, and the cottonwoods had gone bare, and the whole bottom land was white and very still. Mazzy met her at the door without expression, and then took her hands in both of hers and held them, and that was the only welcome ceremony there was, and it was enough. The hands accepted her the way my hands accept most things, practically without comment, on the basis of what they could see. What they could see was a woman who knew horses and fences, and how much salt pork to order for 12 men through a hard winter, and who kept her own counsel and worked without being told. That was more than enough. She was married to me the following March, in the way of my people first and then again for the paper record, because she wanted both, and I agreed that both mattered, and because Mazzy said that 2 ceremonies meant twice the luck, was the most words she had ever spoken in a row about anything. What I remember of that day is not the ceremony. What I remember is standing outside afterward, on the south side of the house, where the snow had melted off the stone foundation, and the earth underneath smelled like spring, and she was beside me, her shoulder against my arm, and we were looking out at the creek bottom, where the cottonwoods were barely beginning to show the first green hint of bud. She said, "Tell me something you haven't told anyone." I thought about it, I said. I almost rode past. In Caldwell. I saw the rope and I sat there and I almost kept going. She said, But you didn't, I said. No, she said. Why not? I said. Because I was tired of being the kind of man who kept going. She was quiet a while. Then she leaned in against my side, her head against my shoulder, and she said, very quietly, I'm glad you were tired. The creek ran cold and clear below the cottonwoods. Somewhere, a hawk was working the thermal, rising off Yef, the south pasture, and it turned and turned up there in the blue without any effort at all, the way a thing does when it has finally found the current it was built for. I put my arm around her. That was enough. That was finally everything.